The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. For today's lecture, we're going to talk about carbohydrates. We left off last time talking about nucleic acids, and before that we talked about proteins. So we're on 3 of the 4 biomolecules. Next time we're going to talk about lipids. But this time I want to talk about carbohydrates. Now, often carbohydrates, especially in today's diet-crazed North America, and I guess you could say diet-crazed developed countries, Europe, China, Japan. There's a lot of countries that have a massive number of diets, and people that are dieting. Carbohydrates are often one of those words that they just get a bad rap. They get a bad name. People are always saying, "Oh, I'm cutting carbs. I'm limiting carbs," whatever it might be. Carbohydrates are far more than just a food source. So through this lecture, I'm going to discuss the different carbohydrates and the role that carbohydrates play as a biomolecule. By and large, carbohydrates are probably, maybe second to proteins, because your DNA is coding for your proteins. But outside of proteins, carbohydrates has got to be, the most important biomolecule, because of the fact that carbohydrates are created or put together from free energy from the sun. All right, now all the biomolecules are important. Obviously, DNA is important. We wouldn't be here. Proteins, we wouldn't be here. Lipids, we wouldn't be here. But carbohydrates is that energy source that we're getting from the sun. So when you think of carbs, you're thinking of this: bread and pasta and potatoes and things like that. Yes, all of those have carbs. Okay? And all of those have carbohydrates. But everything else that you can think of is the result of carbohydrates. All right, so if you're sitting there and saying, "Oh, I'm cutting my carbs, I'm just going to eat chicken for dinner and nothing else, just a bunch of chicken," realize that the chicken got to that point from carbs, and in fact, some of that chicken is carbohydrates. Okay, we're going to look at these different components of carbohydrates and what makes them useful as an energy source, and what makes them useful as the building blocks of certain tissues, etc. So I want you to, think of carbs as more than just bread and grains and things like that, but think of carbs as many, many possible structures, all based on the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, typically in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogen for every 1 oxygen. Okay? So here you can see what we call a monosaccharide, or simple carbohydrate, simple sugar, okay, in the form of glucose. Now this molecule right here is hugely important. Okay? Nearly every single plant, every single photosynthetic organism is generating glucose. Okay? Now, in some portions of those organisms' bodies, they're generating fructose. In some portions of other organisms' bodies, they're generating things like lactose. But glucose, by and large, is the most abundant carbohydrate. Okay? And it's a monosaccharide, so very important. C6H12O6. Okay? So 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. That is glucose. Now, here you can see we have a mixture of glucose molecules, 2 of them, mixed together, and that is a disaccharide, and that forms a molecule called maltose. Okay? And so maltose is, a disaccharide, di meaning two sugars bound together. Okay? Whoops. And then down here you can see all these glucose molecules chained together. Okay? That's a polysaccharide, and that's an example of starch. So yes, glucose is a very common molecule. It's created every second of every day. Okay? Now, it's not stored as glucose very often, though. It's often stored maybe as maltose, but often it's stored as a larger molecule like starch, okay? Or even larger molecules like cellulose. Okay? And so it's that glucose molecule, the result of photosynthesis, okay, that we're going to initially describe when we talk about carbohydrates. We're going to talk about these polysaccharides, these large carbohydrates, and what their role is. And their role is not, I want you to get out of the mindset of the role of this is not to make you fat. Okay? Starches and glucose and maltose, it does not make you fat. Okay? The overconsumption of calories makes individuals fat. And we'll talk about this. It doesn't matter if you're taking in your calories from just eating glucose or sucrose, table sugar, just sitting there and eating table sugar. If you eat too much table sugar, you're going to store it as fat. Or eating, chicken breasts, one chicken breast after another chicken breast after another chicken breast. You get too many calories from chicken breasts, you're going to store it as fat. Okay? So, yes, carbohydrates are fast energy sources, and I'll talk about this, and they're excellent energy sources, but they're also needed for structure support. Okay? And we'll come to that in a little bit. So, let's first talk about what it is to be a carbohydrate. Okay, so carbohydrates are monomers that, again, they can either be utilized as an energy source or utilized as kind of framework or structural support. And we'll look at both of these as we progress. Carbohydrates are molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. When we talk about carbohydrates, as I just discussed, as I just showed you the different types of carbohydrates, you have simple carbohydrates, okay, which we call monosaccharides or even disaccharides. They consist of maybe one or two monomers, one or two molecules or saccharides bound together. And then you have complex carbohydrates, and these can be very long polymers. Okay, we can talk about, in some cases, maybe hundreds of carbohydrates stuck together. Simple carbohydrates, again, they're small. Monosaccharides, probably the best example is glucose. We already discussed this a little bit. Okay, so glucose, there's the chemical formula for it, C6H12O6. And it is a monomer that builds up a lot of other carbohydrates. So this is the monomer, the saccharide that photosynthetic organisms are creating initially, okay, are generating initially. All right, so we'll get to photosynthesis, just touch on it a little bit, but they're doing it by bringing in carbon dioxide, bringing in water. So look, carbon dioxide, CO2, water, H2O. Okay? There's nothing else really going into this system except for carbon dioxide and water, and then energy. And that energy is coming from photons, from light energy. Okay? And that's what allows plants to drive the process of photosynthesis and form glucose. Now, that's not saying that there's not intermediate proteins and pathways that are needed. There are a lot of pathways that are needed of molecules that are far more complex than C6H12O6, but that's the building blocks. Carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. That's what's needed to create glucose or generate glucose. When I say create, remember when we talked about thermodynamics, nothing can be created nor destroyed. So I'm not saying that energy is being created. I'm just saying that they're generating the product of glucose. It's like a factory. You might say at the end of the factory, oh yeah, Tesla created a car. Well, they didn't really create a car. They put it together. They used different, building blocks to form it and put it together, because nothing's being created energetically. So in this case, glucose is technically not created, it's generated. But I use the term created just as a lay term. So if you're cringing every time I say created, I'm not using it as these plants are creating energy. They don't create energy. They generate energy from building glucose molecules or from capturing sunlight and generating glucose molecules. Okay? All right, disaccharides. And disaccharides, two monosaccharides stuck together. Okay, a great example of this is sucrose, or table sugar, sugar that you're going to be consuming constantly. Okay? And that is just the combination of glucose and fructose is going to make sucrose. Glucose and fructose, they have the same chemical formula. They're both C6H12O6. Fructose just has a little bit different arrangement of where the bonds are. And that's what gives it a different chemical composition or a different behavior of that molecule. But together they form sucrose. So here you can see glucose. Okay, that glucose molecule, it is going to bind with the fructose molecule. So you can see that there's just a little bit of a difference in where certain carbons, hydrogen, and oxygens are placed in the molecule. The molecule is still C6H12O6. But the important part is right here. That hydroxyl group binding with this hydrogen to form a bond between the two, and this is called a dehydration reaction. But that reaction creates a bond, an oxygen bonding these two molecules together to form sucrose. Okay? Dehydration reactions always result in water being removed from the system. So you can see here that OH and that H are joining to form water. Water removes. The oxygen then can share the electron over here and the electron over here to form a bond between these two molecules. All right. Complex carbohydrates are long polymer chains. Most of the time they're consisting of some kind of carbon-hydrogen bond. So you can have long chains of carbons, like a carbon backbone, and hydrogens off of it. You can have a carbon ring, like you saw in the last two molecules, or the last molecules there, glucose, fructose, and sucrose. You can have these carbon rings that form with hydrogen bound off of it. But the nice thing, or the great quality, one of the great qualities of carbohydrates is carbon needs 4 electrons to complete its orbitals. Those 4 electrons are easily picked up by hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen will come in and bond with carbon readily. So any place that carbon might need an electron, hydrogen's there to fill that void. This is great for energy because every time you break that bond between carbon and hydrogen, energy is being released. Okay, so if you can link together a bunch of carbons with a bunch of hydrogens off of it, it's a great storage molecule for energy. The other thing is it's a quick molecule to kind of break down. These bonds between carbon and hydrogen, they're not really strong bonds, so it's easy to cleave that bond and take the energy from it. Again, another kind of term for long chains of carbohydrates or long chains of saccharides is we call them polysaccharides. So you have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and then polysaccharides, meaning multiple sugars or multiple saccharides stuck together. So what is it about carbohydrates that make them kind of unique and highly efficient from an energy standpoint? Is you can go from monosaccharide to disaccharide to polysaccharide fairly easily, and you can go backwards. You might have a polysaccharide and you're going to convert it back to a disaccharide, back to a monosaccharide. Breaking these bonds, cleaving these bonds, releases energy. So this is what really allows for carbohydrates to be that kind of energy storage or energy inducing molecule. Plants store energy different than animals do, but they still both are storing this energy based on polysaccharides or based on the formation of glucose and how glucose is being combined in the organism's body. So for plants, that comes in, the storage comes in the form of starch. So like tubers of plants will have a lot of starch, a lot of storage. So if you think about potatoes are grown underground. They're heavy in starch. They're heavy in starch because that plant above the ground during the growing season is generating glucose, and then it's sending glucose into the tubers, into the roots, and it's combining those glucose molecules together to form starch or long-term energy storage. So when the top part of the plant dies off, the next year, that tuber, without any photosynthesis going on, when temperatures are right and water conditions are correct, that tuber, that potato under the ground, can start sending up green material to do photosynthesis because of that stored starch, that stored energy. Animals store their glucose in the form of glycogen inside their muscles. Some polysaccharides that are coming from this that are not based on energy storage but are rather based on structure, you can find in both animals and plants also. So it's not just starch and glycogen, but there are other ways that you can manipulate glucose molecules to form structural support. Part of that, the neat part about that is these long polysaccharides, they're also resistant to most enzymes. So it's hard to digest them. It's hard to break them down. And so for plants, that's called cellulose. That's what's building up the material in the cell wall. So if you're, looking at a chunk of wood, for example, that wood fiber is made of cellulose, right? And that's what's making those cell walls. That's what's making it rigid. So it's just polysaccharides. It's just glucose molecules stacked together. Now there are some extra bonds in there for strengthening, but again, it's just monosaccharides becoming disaccharides, becoming polysaccharides. Chitin's the same way. Chitin is the what makes the material for the exoskeleton of invertebrates, so not an internal skeleton, but the external skeleton for insects and things like that that have these external skeletons, that's made out of polysaccharides also. So glucose molecules bound together in long chains. Okay, again, a couple extra bonds going on, not just carbon-hydrogen bonds going on in these molecules, but still the building blocks for chitin and cellulose is glucose, is these material that's being generated from photosynthesis. Okay, so what is special about cellulose and chitin? Again, it's hard to digest them. There are very few organisms that can go out and just eat tree, eat bark, eat, the inside of the tree, chew on wood, etc., without the help of something. Okay? So for things like beavers, for things like termites, for things that eat a lot of vegetation and get more out of the vegetation than just starch or glucose or fructose, they want to break down the cellulose. They have to have some kind of help. Okay? And that either is through beneficial bacteria that create enzymes that can digest cellulose, or it's through having maybe multiple chambers in your digestive system where you can ferment the material and produce a alcohol that helps break down that cellulose material. Okay? And that really the same thing goes for chitin. There are very few organisms that can break down the exoskeleton of an animal. Okay? And so if you want to test this out, you can always just eat some shrimp. Don't take the tails off. Eat the shrimp. When you defecate, their shrimp tails will still be there. You can't break it down. You don't have digestive enzymes to break down that exoskeleton. Okay? You want to see this and you don't want to do that experiment, you can always just, go find like a raccoon scat or birds that are eating insects, and you can just, push that scat around and you'll see beetle elytra or the exoskeleton of beetles. You might see crayfish skeletons in it, exoskeletons in it. That's because the birds, the raccoons, really none of those organisms can break it down. Now, that doesn't mean detritivores can't break it down. Eventually that material will be broken down. It's just we animals that are consuming these exoskeletons or consuming this cellulose rarely have the enzymes to break it down. So here you can see that cellulose, that polysaccharide, again, multiple glucose molecules linked together in these long chains, and then these chains form chains with other chains, and you just keep building and building and building, and you get these long fibers, okay, that gives that tree that rigidity that we know as being wood. So again, carbohydrates come in multiple forms. They have multiple functions. For example, you can have simple carbohydrates, like lactose. You can have, this is a monosaccharide, but you can have very simple sugars. We already talked about glucose. Okay? You can have lactose and sucrose. Now, these are easily broken down using enzymes. Okay? So the enzyme lactase breaks down lactose. The enzyme sucrase breaks down sucrose. Okay? And then you can have longer storage molecules, longer energy storage molecules, like in the form of starches and glycogens. Okay? Now, these molecules are very similar to each other. The storage molecules of glycogen and starch is very similar. It's just glycogen has more branching, and starches are typically kind of uniform, long-stranded molecules. Okay? But other than that, they're just glucose. It's just glucose linked to glucose molecules in these long strands and sometimes branching strands in the form of glycogen. Okay? And then we have those specialized molecules, which we call structural polysaccharides or structural carbohydrates. And you can see here, again, glucose linked together, but then you have these extra bonds that are included that are a little bit different than some of the other bonds that we see in the other polysaccharides. That gives it that unique structure, and it makes it hard for enzymes to break it down. Same thing with chitin. The base is glucose, but you have other things like a nitrogen, carbon bonds that are going on throughout these molecules. Okay, that makes it a little more rigid and tougher to break down. Okay? So with that, I hope you get a better understanding of carbohydrates in the sense that it shouldn't be a bad word to you. Okay? Carbohydrates are by far the most useful energy source that we have on the planet. Okay? They're simple. Okay? Our body can break them down extremely fast compared to other molecules that we consider energy. Right? So we have the ability to break it down. We've evolved systems to break down carbohydrates. Right? Every organism on the planet has that capability of breaking down carbohydrates and utilizing them for energy. And all organisms use a very similar process, at least initially, that's called glycolysis. And so at least initially, they all use the same simple process to break down glucose molecules. We'll come back and look at this really quick. We'll talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Just touch on it. I don't want to dive into it too deeply, okay? But you should get an idea of how that energy is converted and the role that different organisms play. Next time, we're going to talk about lipids.